So welcome to my talk. I'm glad you all could make it. I see a lot of familiar faces. And so we're wrapping up Women's History Month here at CRC, our celebration of Women's History Month, which is being celebrated all over the country. And the theme of Women's History Month is visionary women, champions of peace and nonviolence. And you might be sitting here thinking to yourselves, well, what am I doing at a talk about apes? Visionary women, why am I here, right? And I'm here to sort of challenge you because in my mind, there are no better visionary females champions of peace and nonviolence than bonobos. I spent the better part of my adult life studying them. So I got my PhD at the University of Buffalo. It was about 10 years ago now, in biological anthropology, and my specialization is that I'm a primatologist, which means that I am an expert in primate behavior, and particularly in the behavior of these magnificent apes called bonobos. After I completed my PhD, I spent some time where they're from in the Congo, and did my postdoctoral fellowship through Emory University there, where I worked on asking questions around whether or not they show empathy, which we often think is a really human sort of characteristic. So a little background before I launch right in about bonobos and the work that I've done and sort of why are you all here today. So for those of you who aren't familiar with bonobos, who haven't gotten that far in your physical anthropology classes yet, or who haven't heard me go on and on about it yet, bonobos are a species of great ape, and along with chimpanzees and gorillas, who you probably have heard of, are native to sort of this region in Africa. So just so that you could tell, because I know the colors don't show up, I put C's where chimpanzees are native to, and then the G's where gorillas are native to, and then there's this blue line right here, and there's a B underneath it, and that is where bonobos are native to currently. And this is also where they did their evolving. Bonobos are really close relatives to chimpanzees, and they, what we call in anthropology, studying evolution, they split, they diverged from a common ancestor with chimpanzees fairly recently in the grand evolutionary scheme of things, which is about 1 million years ago. And again, when you think about evolution happening over the course of billions of years, 1 million really isn't a whole lot. So they share a lot of common characteristics with the chimpanzees that you're all probably really familiar with. What this also represents is that we share a common ancestor with both chimpanzees and bonobos that goes back about 6 million years. So what's the deal with bonobos? So right here you're seeing two male and a female bonobo here, and then you're seeing a male and a female chimpanzee. And at first glance, they look pretty similar. But I'll point out a few differences about them. For starters, male chimpanzees tend to be a little bit bigger than females, whereas bonobo males and females tend to be about the same size. And then also, they're what we call more gracile. Bonobos tend to be a little leaner in their muscle mass. And so chimpanzees, I think of them, they're kind of jacked. They're really muscular, whereas bonobos, they're a little bit more willowy. They don't pack on that kind of muscle mass like we see in chimpanzees. So before I talk about bonobos, I want to talk about chimps, because chimpanzees have been studied for decades. Like really, it's been a very, very long time that we've been aware of the existence of chimpanzees and aware that we share a lot in common with them. They're very human-like. And so back in the 1960s, the famous Jane Goodall, everybody's probably heard of Jane Goodall, went out and studied their behavior in the wild. And she learned a lot of really interesting things about chimpanzees. She learned that they have very strongly bonded males. So the males in the group are related to one another, and they spend a lot of time grooming each other, and and she even discovered that they hunt together. They collectively hunt. So they'll go out together and they will chase a monkey up a tree and grab it and tear it to shreds, and the top-ranking male in the group will eat the best parts and share it with other males, and this is a real bonding experience for chimpanzees. Furthermore, chimpanzees are also really territorial, which means that a troop of chimpanzees they come together and do these border patrols. They walk around the perimeter of their territory, just looking for someone who doesn't belong, you know, making hoots and hollers and saying who's here, who shouldn't be here. And sometimes when they encounter particularly males that belong to another group, they will kill them. They will brutally kill them. They will, and so these sorts of, you know, murders, some primatologists have called them murdered, occurs when they encounter members of another group. And so between the similarities that we share with them physically, and then we find out about all these genetic similarities, we've used them for biomedical modeling and studying our diseases and our medications, and then we're looking at their behaviors of chimpanzees for a really long time. They kind of held up as a living, breathing sort of proto-human, like what must early men have been like. We were warlike, we were territorial, and it almost has been used to sort of justify the patterns of a male-dominated society that we live in today, which can be pretty warlike and violent and so forth, right? So chimpanzees have really stood up as this model. Another thing that's noteworthy about chimpanzees is, remember I mentioned that these are related males, and so something that chimpanzees have in common with bonobos, so I'm going to talk about in just a moment, is that they're what's called male philopatric. And what that means is that the males stay in the group that they're born in. So in every social species, one sex has to leave once they reach reproductive age, or else you'd have a real problem with incest, right? And in most primates, it's the females who stay in the group that they're born in. But with chimpanzees, it's the males that stay. And in chimpanzees, it's the males that are very closely bonded to one another. So let's just move over to bonobos, just having all that knowledge on board. So here's some beautiful ladies of bonobo community in the Congo. So the structure's the same. You have a similar scenario in bonobos where you have large social groups, lots of different males and females, lots of individuals, and you have males that stay in the group that they're born in, okay? So that means that the females aren't related to one another. So let's just keep that on board for a second. What happens in bonobo society, though, that's totally different from chimpanzees? Unrelated females comprise the societal core of bonobo groups. They make all the decisions. They are closely bonded to one another. They are what's called female-centric and female-bonded. And they use cooperation with one another to control resources and, in essence, to keep males away from those resources, if they so desire. These bonds are reinforced in some of the typical ways that primates bond with one another, which is sharing food, grooming one another, sleeping in close proximity, letting them play with your babies and things, that level of trust. But then bonobos take it a step further. Bonobos use sex, not just for procreation, but for a whole spectrum of social functions. And for those of you who have heard of bonobos in the room, it's likely that this is what you've heard about. And so what we see in bonobo societies is going to be less violence than what we see in chimpanzee societies. We have never witnessed one bonobo killing another. It's never been witnessed in the wild. It's never been witnessed in captivity. Excuse me. And intergroup encounters tend to be positive, and they tend to be sexual. And this is a sharp contrast to the bloodied male chimpanzee that I just showed you a couple of slides ago, right? Big contrast. What happens when bonobo groups encounter one another in the wild, so you have a group of females that all know each other, and then they encounter another group of females that all know each other, rather than beating each other to a bloody pulp, they have sex. So a while ago, my former boss at Emory, Frans de Waal, who's one of the biggest bonobo researchers there is, said that they are the apes that make love, not war. And I want to talk to you a little bit about how this might come to be from sort of an evolutionary perspective. What we have hypothesized about how bonobos came to be this way, where you have a whole bunch of unrelated females that are able to basically suppress violent urges of males and to keep them away from food and to prevent them from sexually coercing them, is that below the Zaire River, remember how I showed you that blue line and the bee underneath it? Below the Zaire River, where they were evolving, we had an abundance of food for a very long time. So over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, food was abundant. And when you're not fighting with one another to fill your belly, the potential for a lot more complex social behaviors can arise. Because what we see in some primate groups is that there's a need for sort of big, strong males to protect a territory and the females in that territory and the offspring of the females in that territory so that they can be guaranteed to have those food resources. But when food is abundant and you take that variable out of play, you end up with a scenario where females take charge and they use sex rather than violence whenever social tensions do arise. Because they're still social primates. I mean, things get worked up, you know? I mean, they'll still get excitable over food. They'll still get excitable in different social contexts, but it doesn't have to end in these knockdown, drag-out, bloody fights. Instead, there can be a lot of reassuring behaviors around around this, and a lot of the time it takes the form of sexual behavior. So the context that we see sexual behavior in bonobos, obviously I just mentioned calming sexual or social tensions and reassuring other individuals. It's going to be okay, calm down. Reinforcing social bonds. Females, remember, they don't have the advantage of sharing their genetics, to sharing blood. They're not sisters. So it reinforces the bond that they share with one another as friends. And there is a social hierarchy in bonobos, which means that individuals have a place. They know their place. There is an alpha and a beta and so forth and so forth. We'll talk about that in a moment. It's not a free-for-all. But the sexual behavior reinforces the hierarchy. And then finally, as I mentioned, it's a way that groups can greet each other in the wild and integrate new group members. Because think about it. Female comes of age in the group that she's born in, and she reaches the point where she can, where she's reached puberty, basically, and she needs to leave so that there isn't any kind of incest, inbreeding. Well, how does she get incorporated into a new group? She's got to leave her family and go among all these strangers. And it's a lot more welcoming than you might expect. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So really, what we see is a pattern of sex as essentially a social currency, really. And so this is an amazing picture that I came across this year. This is 3 different bonobo female families in the Congo that came together at the same time. And it's extraordinary. So these 3 different groups had never encountered one another before. And they're sort of peacefully hanging out in the forest together. And it's just a gorgeous picture. I couldn't believe it. Just this year this was taken. So I know you all want to hear the sexy details. I won't leave you hanging. So let's talk about it. First of all age-sex combinations do it. All age-sex combinations of bonobos have sex. And literally, from the time they're infants, they are sexually curious because they see their mothers, their brothers, they see everyone doing it all the time. And so the infants, whenever they get a little bit worked up about something, they go ahead and, want to have some kind of sexual contact from the time they're very small. And they have this kind of contact with one another. Like infant with juvenile, and even infants with adults. Like they'll want to rub their genitals with the adults. True story. So this is the rated R part. What do they do? Okay, so obviously there's intercourse, right? And when we think about intercourse, we think about, when in the context of non-human animals, we think about it for breeding, right? But in the context of bonobos, intercourse occurs as a way of easing social tensions and all of these other reasons that I had mentioned. And what's interesting about it is they do it face-to-face. And when we think about sex with non-human animals, we're used to thinking about the whole, doggy style thing, right? They do that, but they also do it face-to-face. And eye contact is a really big part of this social bonding that they're doing. So what you're seeing here is a male and a female, and there's her infant with the big grin. I'll talk about the grin in a moment, but a grin is in brief, it's a show of sort of tension, okay? A little bit of social tension. But see how she's got food in her hand? She's got food in her hand. That male wants some of that food. And this is his way of saying, will you give me some food? This is the most important and prominent type of sex in bonobo society. Aren't you all glad you came today? So these are two females that are facing one another, what we call ventroventrally. So their fronts are facing each other. Their legs are wrapped around each other. And what you see here, those are actually their engorged labias. And if this was a video, which it isn't, and I press play, what you would see are these labia rubbing up against each other like rapid fire. And they can both reach climax at the same time. True story. This happens so often that it's literally a couple dozen times a day. And I'm someone who watched them for like 8 hours a day for years, and you really do become desensitized to this. Because everything makes them want to have sex. Every little thing is like, let's do it. So manual stimulation, this is where I saw the young males getting the most involved. So if you think about the way bonobo culture is, you have a lot of these really powerful females that kind of intimidate males a bit. And these little males, they really just want some love, and they want a little attention. And when they get all excited and worked up, they get an erection. And they present that erection to females. And all a female really has to do is just reach her hand out and touch the male. And he sort of gyrates on her hand, and then he calms down, and she's like, okay, are you done? Really, the look on their face is amazing. And the males are like, they show their teeth, and they're bobbing their heads. And then the female, it's her job to sort of calm them down. And more often than not, the females will appease these males. It's a very quick interaction that occurs. And it really does work in terms of quieting the tensions that these young males feel. They kiss. Sometimes they use tongues. I didn't show you one of those. You're welcome. And they hug. And then the things I'm not going to show you, obviously, are these. But they do them, too. They're just a bit rare. So oral and anal are also on the menu for bonobos. Okay. A little bit more on the sexy details, because you haven't had enough yet. I want you to pay attention to the facial gestures. So this is what I was talking about. I see a lot of you in here baring your teeth. Huh. So a little awkward, huh? So our laughter and our smile showing our teeth didn't start just because stuff was funny. It didn't start because of sitcoms on television, right? It started actually as more of an indication that they're nervous, that you feel nervous. And so how many of you remember being in a situation in your life where it's awkward and you're like, ha, 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 right? You know what I'm talking about. Some of you might feel awkward right now. This is totally commonplace for all of the other primates. Like, showing teeth isn't like a happy gesture. And just FYI, when you see primates in entertainment and they're being cute and showing their teeth, they're not happy, right? They're actually afraid. It's a fear thing. And so what these bonobos are looking for here from one another, this one is looking for this very relaxed female. This male is looking at a very relaxed female. They're saying, will you calm me down, please? And they need that sexual contact to be calmed down. So because for some reason I really like studying this stuff, I decided to dedicate my life to it. So my research, there's a great colony of bonobos at the Columbus Zoo in Ohio. And I studied 3 main topics for my doctorate. I studied dominance hierarchy. Not a lot at the time, and still really not a lot is known about bonobo dominance hierarchies. And so, excuse me, the extent to which individuals sort of discreetly outrank one another, right? How they, excuse me, how it is that that rank sort of shuffles out in bonobo society. in addition, I wanted to know about aggression, and because it's not like aggression is absent in bonobos just because they have sex. There is aggression. It's just not typically really violent. It's not typically bloody, okay? It's usually the form of threats, mild slapping, you know, and hitting and things like that, but not the degree that we are used to seeing in chimpanzees and all these other different primates. So I wanted to know about what I called patterns of aggression. And then, most interestingly, I was curious about what happened after a fight. So if a fight breaks out, even if it's a mild threat given from one individual to another, and you have a distressed victim, do they come back together to repair any damage that may have happened as a result of that fight? And then, consolation. Consolation is when a third party, an uninvolved individual, looks at a victim and says, they are distressed. I want to go and calm them down. And consolation's a big one when it comes to thinking about things like empathy and the capacity for really deep thoughts of the mind, because it requires you to put yourself in the mindset of another. And so consolation was the real kind of money one in this whole thing for me, just as someone who's excited to have the data to show what I feel that they're truly capable of. So what are my results? The alpha is always female. This is Susie, and the time that I was there, she was the alpha for the whole time. She's no longer the alpha. She still lives there, but another one has her rank. Now she got older, just lost her rank. That's a whole talk for another time. But while I was there, this was our alpha, and she's wonderful. She was just a pleasure to see every day. She's a very cool bonobo. So then I talked about rank, and I thought about rank. And so I had a couple hypotheses about what would happen in terms of rank in the group. And so I knew that the alpha was always female. In other words, Susie, if there were fights, she always won. Everybody deferred to her. And what was happening below that was a pretty consistent pattern of like females that ranked below her, and then another would rank below the other, and then I knew that the males, for the most part, were all at the bottom because they were constantly deferring to the females. They never really won in a conflict. There were all these different indicators that I looked at to show what dominance is. I don't have the time to get into those now, but one of the things that I was curious about, though, is this. I asked in a paper I gave and in my dissertation, is it possible that the alpha male, who is the firstborn son of Susie, this guy Donnie, if he could outrank any of the females, the lowest of the females, her name was Unga, and she was a low-ranking female who was brought in, and she had to earn her rank. She's the alpha now, by the way. But there were times where I was really curious what the data would show, and indeed, Unga surprised me. She always had rank over him. And so the truth was, it was really a system of all females outranking all males at all times. In the scenario at the zoo, there were days where Donnie wouldn't be with his mother. And I predicted that maybe when he's not with his mom and mom can't have his back, that Unga, that maybe he would outrank Unga in certain dominance disputes. Didn't happen. Unga was always a little bit eking him out for rank. And indeed, it was this system. So I also found that the hierarchy is linear. So what this means is that there are stable dominance relationships. In other words, if Susie's at the top, and Lady is second, and Lucy is third, and Unga is fourth, which is how it kind of shook out there, there's not much challenging of this. They sort of accept their places and their roles, which is what we mean by a linear hierarchy. It's a stable system. It doesn't mean that rank shifts don't happen. It just means that they weren't being challenged all the time. It wasn't terribly flexible. Aggression, not surprisingly, was infrequent and mild. This is Lady, and she threatened Ricky all the time. This is poor Ricky, who was like the one that was always presenting and needing reassurance. He was just this kind of sad little male. The context of aggression tended to be feeding. They'd get really excited when the keepers would bring them food. Of course, that's going to, potentially lead to aggression. Donnie, the one I just showed you the picture of, that's the aggressive, high-ranking male. He definitely caused some tension in the group and scrap it up a little bit. And Donnie would pick on Ricky because he outranked Ricky, so I'd see some fights between them sometimes. And then annoying males, and that's where our friend Ricky comes in. He would just, sometimes the females just did not want to appease him, and they would smack him around a little bit. And so I call him annoying males. And he really was. And then reconciliation and conciliation both did occur, and the form that reconciliation and conciliation took was largely in the form of sex. Okay, not surprising. I then went on to work with bonobos at a sanctuary in the Congo. So this is me in the nursery there. It's me getting my foot groomed. So this is at a sanctuary called Lola Ya Bonobo, and I was sort of expanding on the work I did with consolation. So this idea of that empathy is possible, that one of the last things that humankind, want to hold on to that say this separates us from the animals is our ability to empathize with others, to put ourselves into the mental state of others. And one of the reasons that this project was funded is because we had a lot of information up to that point that indicated that bonobos really do show typical human indicators of empathy in the form of sharing with one another, in the form of consoling victims, and then most importantly in the form of altruistic behaviors or helping behaviors when it could potentially hurt yourself. Unfortunately, there was a lot of issues around my methodology. I didn't finish the postdoc, but there has been future research that really did concur with a lot of the predictions and hypotheses that I had at the time. Excuse me. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears for a moment, and because this is Women's History Month, and I think we probably forgot that by now. But it's Women's History Month, and I want to talk to you a little bit about women's roles, and I want to talk to you a little bit about what's happened for me in the 10 years since I stopped doing research. I've been teaching anthropology at the community college level for quite some time, and in teaching cultural anthropology and in thinking about human culture in a way I never did when I was in graduate school, I've had the pleasure of being able to outline and research and option a book that I've been working on for a while now. And I'm going to use this opportunity to sort of tell you where I'm at in my thought process with the book and what it's all about and how I see women's roles sort of factoring into what we know about bonobos and vice versa. So this is my tiny little primer on women's history, and I really want to preface it with saying broad strokes. Whenever you talk about humankind, whenever you talk about humans, we are such a complex species that have essentially colonized the planet. There are different behavior patterns and different environmental pressures all over the world, and so it's hard to paint with broad strokes. So keeping that in mind, I'm going to paint with some broad strokes. Humans were hunter-gatherers until about 13,000 years ago, which means that we were nomadic. We sort of made our way through the landscape where typically the role of men as hunter, woman as gatherer, because, hunting, you could potentially scare away your prey, and you can't scare away a blueberry when you have a baby that's making a lot of noise. So women as gatherer and men as hunters sort of come out of this. And what's really remarkable to me is that, so 13,000 years ago, we get the idea as humans that we're going to start to domesticate, that we're going to bring it to us, right? We're going to start to selectively breed plants and animals, and we're going to settle down, and we're not going to wait for the landscape to give us our food. We're going to produce it ourselves, okay? We're going to start staying put. And in a really, really short period of time, in the grand scheme of things, remember, because we're talking about human evolution over the course of millions of years, and in the course of a couple of thousand years, we go from the first domestication to cities. And then we get civilizations. And it's wonderful in a lot of ways, because from this we get the wheel, and we get writing, and we get all of these incredible technological advances that we can be so happy about. But what we also see is a shift in women's roles. And it's one that can't be denied, in my opinion, especially as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about the roles of bonobo females. So what ends up happening, sort of in brief, is with agriculture comes property, right? You start having property and you start having wealth. And what ends up happening alongside this is we see what we call division of labor. Different people do different things. You can store up your food and save it, and you can accumulate wealth in this way. You can take your grain and save it for a rainy day, and you could end up with an economy, so to speak, where you're now selling your goods to others, and you're coming up with better ways to harvest your plants. And again, it's this whole division of labor that starts to occur. From this, we get status. From this, we get social classes, the likes of which are impossible for hunter-gatherers, because in hunter-gatherer society, you can't take it with you. You can't have stuff. You can't have jewels. You can't have the greatest house on the block. You can't have any of this, right? But once you can, everything starts to change, and we start to see status and social class, and we start to see greed. I want more than my neighbor. I want to have it all. I want to be at the top, okay? And so what ends up happening in the course of history, and again, broad strokes, men get an upper hand in a way that they didn't have or need to have when we were hunter-gatherers. When you're hunter-gathering, everybody's sort of contributing. They're contributing in different ways. Sex roles are sex roles, but women had the power to space their babies apart, for example, to have them 4 or 5 years apart, and to be involved in the activities of their particular band or group that they were living in. When we see the advent of agriculture and cities and wealth and social class, women themselves kind of become like property. Have lots of kids, have them back to back. The more kids you have, the more hands to work the farm. Well, when you're either pregnant or nursing, how do you become an economic player? How do you become involved in the politics and the decision-making of the time? You don't. You're at home raising the kids to work the farm to bring the wealth. And so from this, we end up seeing systems of monogamy and polygamy. We end up seeing a lot of the rules around this being built into our religious texts that are also coming around that time as well. And women don't get a whole lot of say in much of anything until we get our fertility back in 1960. What happened in 1960? Pill. So we can now say, I'm going to decide when I'm going to have kids or if I'm going to have kids. Okay? So this is my very, very brief sort of selfish lead-in to what I'm capping this whole thing off with, which is my musings and forthcoming book. So I think about the way the world is today, and I see it as a bunch of cogs of power, greed, and wealth, and oppression, not only of women, but of many different social groups, and violence, and these wheels spin, okay? And it's all part of this post-agricultural system that is patriarchal and built upon socioeconomic classes, okay? So the book that I'm planning to write, that I'm outlining, that I'm working on, that I should really get back to work on, is a trip back in time, where I think to myself, what if human females got the upper hand instead? What if there was a low feeding competition scenario in agriculture? And a lot of this might even sort of be impossible when you think about it, but just work with me. Where we have to ask ourselves, would violence and greed be the driving force that it has been for 13,000 years? Would we necessarily be as territorial and xenophobic or afraid of other groups if we went the bonobo way? Might we have adapted a sexual way of life over a violent way of life. Then I think some more. Thoughts get bigger. And I think to myself, well, what is natural and normal when it comes to sex roles and sexual behavior? As someone who watched bonobos have sex in every possible combination imaginable, like 50 times a day, you gotta scratch your head and ask yourself, is anything normal? Right? Because it works for them, and it gets you thinking about what the true nature of women is. And so I love this movie. This was the remake of Wonder Woman. I love Wonder Woman. But what I don't like is that for women to be badass, they have to be violent. They have to be like men. They have to be mounting their horse with their bow and arrow and violent in order for them to be this badass matriarchal society, because that's just what's assumed, right? But why don't we assume something else? Right now, sex is taboo and violence is normalized, right? If you turn on a TV at 8 o'clock p.m., you can find some crazy violence on television. Totally uncensored, unedited violence. But God forbid you show a woman's nipple. Flip it. Turn it around. What if violence was the taboo thing? What if sex in all of its crazy forms was normal? Just saying. So then I have more thoughts. Can society exist without greed? Is greed learned? Is it something that's part of our nature? Because I have a lot of students that ask me, what do you think is wrong with the world? Like, what do you think it is? What do you think is wrong with us? And I always say it's greed, folks. Everything boils down to greed. And where does greed come from? I don't have all the answers. Just out here asking questions. Can agriculture exist without sexism? And what I mean by sexism is like sex roles where one is oppressing the other. Can we have a system of agriculture without that? Are we naturally monogamous? Those of you in my classes, we will talk about that this semester. Is it possible for sex to take the place of violence? Have we gone too far, or can it? Is war necessary if we do think about these things? So, we have a living, breathing model in bonobos for how a system could work that is sexual, that is fairly nonviolent, and that is female-dominated, female-centric. And indeed, they are the champions of peace and nonviolence. Okay, I think that's it. Okay, thank you for coming.